Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the Long-Term Care Hospital Quality Reporting Program follow-up webinar for providers. My name is Glenna Davis, and I will be your host and moderator today. Before we get started, I will review a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded. It will later be posted to CMS's LTCH QRP training website, and we will provide you with details on accessing the recording via email when it is available. If you would like to take advantage of the closed captioning function, please click on the Settings button near the top of your screen to enable the closed captioning. If you would like to download today's presentation slide deck, please click on the folder icon that is located on the bottom right of your screen, and the presentation slide deck will also be posted to the LTCH QRP training website. The phone lines will be on mute for the duration of the presentations today. Due to the large number of attendees on today's webinar, we are unable to field questions over the phone, but you are able to submit questions via the chat function near the bottom left of your screen. If you have a question at any point throughout today's presentations, please enter it into the chat panel. I'm joined by my colleagues, Bridget and Sharon, who will be monitoring and responding to questions and comments in the chat. Questions will be answered by our presenters during the Q&A session at the conclusion of today's webinar. In the event the time doesn't allow for us to address all questions, you will be emailed a response. Responses to all submitted questions will also be available and published on the LTCH QRP webpage. We will email all attendees when the webinar's Q&As are published. Throughout today's event, we will be using the function of polling questions. Polling questions allow the speakers to ask you questions to gauge your understanding of the material that's being presented. Each polling question will appear in a separate window in the center of your screen. Review the answer choices that are offered and choose your answer. There is no need to hit submit. Once you choose your answer, it will be automatically submitted for you. You can change your answer at any time before the poll is closed. Your answers are confidential and will only be reported in aggregate percentages. Now let's test out the polling function with our first question. You should now see on your screen the polling question window appear in the center of your monitor. The question is, how many people, including yourself, were in the room attending this webinar? Please choose your answers from the options on the screen. And as you can see, the polling function is fairly simple, and we look forward to your participation throughout today's webinar. So thank you, everyone. We're able to see aggregate percentages of how the group has also answered. So thank you for participating. Now on for today's agenda. Today's webinar was created specifically as a provider follow-up training for the Long-Term Care Hospital Quality Reporting Program. We will cover Section GG, Section M, Section O, and review available resources. Due to the length of today's event, we will take two short breaks at about 2:20 p.m. and 3:55 p.m. Eastern Time. We will conclude the event with a question and answer session and finally a wrap-up. At this time, I'd like to introduce today's speakers. Presenting on Section GG is Ann Deutsch. And originally, Ann was to be joined by Tara McMullen, but unfortunately, Tara is unavailable to join us today. Dr. Deutsch is a Senior Research Public Health Analyst with RTI International. She was part of the team that developed the CARE tool and was involved in training of data collectors and data analysis in the Medicare Post-Acute Care Payment Reform Demonstration. She is a certified rehabilitation registered nurse with a doctoral degree in epidemiology and community health. Presenting on Section M is Terry Mata. Ms. Mata is a nurse consultant at CMS, working in the Division of Chronic and Post-Acute Care on the implementation of the IMPACT Act, development of cross-setting quality measures, and also post-acute assessment item set development and data element standardization. Ms. Mata has 22 years of geriatric nursing experience in a variety of nursing and leadership positions. Opening today's webinar and also presenting on Section O and available resources is Terry Kahlert-Eng. Dr. Kahlert-Eng is a research public health analyst in RTI International's Healthcare Quality and Outcomes program. She is currently the LTCH setting lead on the development and maintenance of symptom management measures project with CMS. And this project is aimed at developing quality measures for patients in LTCHs, as well as across other post-acute care settings as legislated by the IMPACT Act of 2014. Dr. Kaylor Ng has more than 30 years of experience in acute care nursing leadership roles. We're pleased to have such an experienced and knowledgeable speakers present on today's webinar, and we're most grateful and thankful for them being here today. It is now my pleasure to turn this session over to Dr. Kaylor Ng. And Dr. Ng, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenna, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. The purpose of today's webinar, offered by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services for Long-Term Care Hospitals, is to primarily focus on sections GG, Functional Abilities and Goals, and M, Skin Conditions, of the LTCH Care Data Set version 3.00. Additionally, information about Section O and where to find additional assistance will also be covered. The goal of today's training is to address some of the questions providers asked during and after the training held in Baltimore, Maryland on November 19th. Presentations will reflect major questions and issues raised during the November training and are not designed to be comprehensive instructions. For a more comprehensive review of these sections, or if you missed the November 19th training in Baltimore, please be sure to download and review the training materials posted on the LTCH Quality Reporting Training webpage on cms.gov. Today's presentations will only focus on questions pertaining to the long-term care hospital setting. Other settings, such as inpatient rehabilitation facilities or skilled nursing facilities, will be addressed during setting-specific trainings later in the year. You may also find it helpful to have a copy of the LTCH Care Data Set in front of you as we proceed with the webinar. In addition to the formal presentations, there will be time dedicated at the end of today's webinar to address audience questions. We encourage you to submit your questions as you think of them by using the chat feature located on the bottom left corner of your screen. All of our speakers will be available at the conclusion of the webinar to address questions posed throughout the webinar. Please also note that answers to many of the questions submitted by participants during the LTCH provider training offered in Baltimore on November 19th and 20th have been posted and are available on the LTCH QRP training webpage on the CMS website. Again, we thank you for joining us for today's follow-up webinar for LTCH providers. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker presenting on Section GG, Functional Abilities and Goals, Dr. Deutsch.
Great. Thank you so much, Terry. So on slide 8, you'll see that the objectives of Section GG are that following this presentation, participants will be able to define the items and rating scales included in Section GG, Functional Abilities and Goals. Participants will be able to explain the intent of the Section GG items. They will be able to discuss the coding instructions and needed information for the items, and this opportunity will provide some practice coding scenarios. So on the next slide, you'll see, as we went through in the November training, the intent of these items. So first of all, I wanted to mention that there's essentially 3 types of items in this section. The first focus on prior functioning. The second set of items we'll be talking about are focused on admission and discharge performance, and we have both self-care and mobility items collected at admission and discharge. And then also we will be talking about discharge goal items. The admission and discharge self-care and mobility items assess the patient's need for assistance with self-care and mobility activities. An activity in the context of this training and the LTCH Care Data Set refers to the execution of a task or action by an individual. As we discussed in November, many patients in LTCH have self-care mobility limitations, and many are at risk for further functional decline and complications due to limited mobility. And that is why we have several functional assessment items on the LTAC Care data set. The first set of items that we'll be talking about today will be a review, and this is the items GG0100, prior functioning everyday activities. You'll see that there's only one item on the LTAC Care data set focused on indoor mobility ambulation. The rating scale and coding instructions for GG0100 are that this item is only completed at admission, and the available codes for indicating the patient's level of prior functioning related to indoor mobility are code 3, independent, if the person is able to perform the activity by him or herself with or without a device but no assistance from a helper. Code 2 is used if the person needed some help. Code 1 is used if the person is dependent. In other words, the helper completed the activity for the patient. Code 8 is used when the information is unknown. That means that the patient's usual ability prior to the current illness, exacerbation, or injury is not known. Or Code 9 is used to mean not applicable if the activity was not applicable to the patient prior to the current illness, exacerbation, or injury. The next item that we'll be reviewing is prior device use, which is GG0110. So as you can see for coding instructions, this item is completed only at the time of admission, and there are 3 devices that we are asking you to indicate if the person used prior to their current illness or injury or exacerbation. Those 3 items are manual wheelchair, motorized wheelchair or scooter, or mechanical lift. If the patient did not use any of those devices prior to their current illness, injury, or exacerbation, you would check none of the above. The items that are included, wheelchair, manual wheelchair, scooter, and mechanical lift, are included because they are risk adjusters for the functional outcome measure. So during the training in November, we got a lot of excellent questions, and so one of the things that I'll be doing in this presentation today is reviewing some of the common questions that were submitted. And so as you can see, the first question we have here was one of the ones submitted by several people, and it's an excellent question. What is the time frame for prior to admission? So on the next slide, you'll see the answer to that question is that prior functioning is the time frame used for items GG0100, prior functioning, and GG0110, prior device use. So those are the 2 items that we just reviewed. The time frame for prior to admission refers to the patient's functioning and device use immediately before the current illness, injury, or exacerbation. If the patient's episode of care started with an acute care hospital stay followed by an LTAC stay, the patient's prior functioning would be based on the patient's status immediately before the illness, injury, or event that led to the acute care stay. So we did get actually several specific examples. The next question follows directly after this general question with an example. So this person submitted a question and said, if a patient had a spinal cord injury 30 years ago and is now admitted for wound care, how do you code GG0110? Would it be based on the 30-year-old injury or the wounds? So the correct response to that question is that in this example, the patient had a spinal cord injury 30 years ago and is now admitted to an LTAC for treatment of wounds. The item GG0100B, indoor mobility ambulation, would be coded based on his or her need for assistance with indoor ambulation prior to the admission for the wound. So we got another question about indoor mobility, GG0100B, and that question was, what is the difference between 8 unknowns and dash not assessed, no information? So for those of you who are familiar with the LTCH care dataset submission process, you're aware that you are not able to leave any items blank for the submission process, and so a dash is used. So in this case, we do include the 8 unknowns because we wanted to give clinicians an option to indicate that they did try and gather this information. So as you can see on the answer slide, the response is that the clinician should attempt to obtain prior functioning information from the patient, family member, or the patient's medical record. If the information is not available from these sources, code 8 unknown. If there was not an attempt by the clinician or anyone else to obtain this information, code a dash to indicate not assessed, no information. I do want to be sure to mention that the items that are required do require a response other than a dash. And if you want more information about the dash, I would recommend you look specifically at Chapter 3, Introduction, page 6, where there is a description of use of the dash and also indicates that a warning is provided when dashes are used. So now I'll move to section GG0130, the self-care activities. And what you see on this slide is that on the LTCH care data set, we have the rating scale on the left side of the page. You report the performance in the first column where you can enter codes, which is highlighted in the gold box. And then information about goals is reported in the box that is not highlighted. The items, the items that we provided training on during the webinar, during the in-person training in November are provided on the next slide, and they are, I'm not going to go over the definitions again because that is obviously available in the training manual. But I did want to highlight that there are items such as eating, oral hygiene, toileting hygiene, and wash upper body for the self-care activities. And as we discussed in November, LTCH patients may have self-care limitations on admission, and they may be at risk for further decline during the stay, hence the attention to these particular items. So with regard to the coding instructions for the self-care activities, these items are completed on admission. So when A0250 is equal to 1, which is admission, or if A0250 is 10, which is a planned discharge. So we will be covering the unplanned discharge and expired form separately as a question because we did get several questions about that. So just to review the rating scale, it is a 6-point rating scale that is used for each of the self-care activities as well as each of the mobility items that we'll be covering today. And level 6 refers to independent. Level 5 refers to setup or cleanup assistance. Level 4 corresponds to supervision or touching assistance. Level 3 is tied to partial moderate assistance. Level 2 refers to substantial maximal assistance, and Level 1 refers to dependent. When we've done training previously, we found that it's been helpful for clinicians to understand the key questions that need to be asked in order to determine the rating score that would be given based on the person's activity level. So we have that on the next few slides. So the first question that you would ask would be, does the patient need assistance to complete the self-care activities? And the assistance would include physical assistance, verbal, nonverbal cueing assistance, as well as setup, cleanup assistance. And if the answer is no, you would code level 6, independent. If the answer to that first question is yes, then you would ask the second question, does the patient need only setup or cleanup assistance? If the answer is yes, you would code 5, setup or cleanup assistance. If the answer is no, you would go to the next question. Does the patient need only verbal, nonverbal cueing or steadying or touching assistance? If the answer is yes, code 4, supervision or touching assistance. If no, you would ask the next question, which is, does the patient need lifting assistance or trunk support with the helper providing less than half of the effort? If the answer is yes, you would code 3, partial moderate assistance. If the answer is no, you would go to the next question, which is, does the patient need lifting assistance or trunk support with the helper providing more than half of the effort? If the answer is yes, you would code no, substantial maximal assistance. If the answer is no, you would move to the last question, which is, does the helper provide all of the effort to complete the activity? And if the answer is yes to that, you would code level 1. I do want to also mention that we had several questions. People were asking about circumstances where 2 or more helpers were providing assistance. And so as we indicated in the training in November and in the training manual, you are correct that 2 or more people would be coded level 1. In terms of the rating scale, we are aware that patients are sometimes not able to attempt an activity, and so we have very specific codes to indicate why the person was not able to perform the activity. So one of the options is that the patient refused to perform the activity. That would be coded 07, patient refused. We also have a code of 09, not applicable, if the patient did not perform the activity prior to the current illness, exacerbation, or injury. And finally, the code 88, not attempted due to medical condition or safety concerns, would be coded if the activity was not attempted due to the medical condition of the patient or any safety concerns. So, as I said before, we have, as part of this follow-up training, a few case scenarios, coding scenarios, examples, as well as some of the questions and the responses to those questions that came up from November. So this is one of the first questions that came up. We actually got questions about providing additional examples for certain levels. And so this particular one is targeted related to that suggestion that we had from the November training. So this will be a polling example. So in this particular case, the example is that the nurse opens up all of Mrs. S's cartons and containers on a food tray before leaving the room. There are no safety concerns regarding Mr. S's ability to eat. Mr. S eats the food himself, brings the food to his mouth, and uses appropriate utensils and swallows the food safely. So the polling question that we have for you is, how would you code eating, GGO130A? Possible responses that you could choose from for this coding scenario are 6, independent, 5, setup or cleanup, 4, supervision or touching assistance, 3, partial moderate assistance. And I'll give everybody a short time to answer the polling question. It looks like people are still answering, so I'll wait a bit longer. Looks like we have a popular response at level 5. Okay, so the correct response was indeed 5, so excellent. And the rationale is that the helper provided setup assistance only prior to the activity. Okay, so we have another example. Mrs. B has had difficulty seeing on her left side since her stroke. During meals, a helper has to remind her to scan her entire meal tray to ensure she has seen all her food. How would you code GGO130A eating for Mrs. V? Possible options are on the next slide. 04, supervision touching assistance. 3, partial moderate assistance. 2, partial maximal assistance. 9, not applicable. And it looks like it's got people responding. Okay, numbers still seem to be going up. We've got some people coding 4, some people coding 3, a few people coding 2, and a few people coding not applicable. Okay, so in this case, the correct response was the one that many people did choose, which is 4, supervision or touching assistance. In this scenario, the helper provides verbal cueing assistance to Mrs. V as she completes the activity of eating. And just in terms of just additional bit of information, supervision, such as reminders, may be provided throughout an activity or intermittently, and they would be still coded for, regardless of whether it was intermittent or throughout the activity. Okay, we will now move to another example, but this one relates to oral hygiene. So in this particular example, Ms. T is recovering from a severe brain injury and multiple bone fractures. She does not understand how to use oral hygiene items, nor does she understand the process of completing oral hygiene. The certified nursing assistant brushes her teeth and explains each step of the activity to engage cooperation from Ms. T. However, Ms. T requires full assistance for the activity of oral hygiene. So our polling question is, how would you code GGO130B for Ms. T? The possible responses that you can choose from the polling will be 2, substantial maximal assistance, 4, supervision or touching assistance, 1, dependent, or 88, not attempted due to medical condition or safety concern. Okay, so looks like we've got some people responding to 2 and 1. And we have people responding to each of them at this point. Okay, we'll just give everybody a bit more time to get their responses in. Okay. I think, yeah, slowing down now. Okay, great. So many people did code the correct response. In this case, the correct response is oral hygiene would be coded 1, dependent. The helper provides all of the effort for the activity to be completed, and that's the response. So even though the patient was engaged in terms of the assistance, the helper provided all of the effort, and that is the rationale for the level 1. Okay, so we have another example now, which is related to toileting hygiene. So in this particular example, we have Mr. J is morbidly obese and has several diagnoses, including debility. He requests the use of a bedpan when voiding or having a bowel movement, and requires 2 certified nursing assistants to mobilize him onto and off a bedpan. Mr. J is unable to complete any of his perineal or perianal hygiene. How would you code GGO130C? This again is a polling question, and the response options that you can choose from will be 04, supervision or touching assistance, 02, substantial or maximal assistance, code 1, dependent, or code 7, patient refused. So the polling questions are up there, and the scenario is at the top of the page in case you wanted to look at that again. Okay, it looks like we've still got people submitting questions. Okay, give folks a little bit more time. Thank you for participating, by the way, in the polling. It's very helpful to see the response codes. Okay, so it looks like most people did code the correct response, which is level 1 dependent. In this case, the patient was only able to perform the activity with the assistance of 2 helpers. And as I indicated before, when 2 helpers are required to help the patient perform 1 activity, the correct response would be level 1. Okay. So at this point, I will turn it back over to Glenna to give a little bit more detail about the break that's coming up.
Thank you so much, Dr. Deutsch. Everyone, we will now take a short break. Please refer to the timer on your screen for when we will promptly reconvene. I'm going to set the timer for about 15 minutes, so if you all could return in 15 minutes, we will reconvene and continue on with the presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, great. So we'll pick up with another question that we received following the November webinar. And this particular question actually applies to both the self-care activities as well as the mobility items. So GGO130 as well as GGO170. And the question is, if a patient is discharged unexpectedly, what is coded for section GGO130 and GGO170? And they suggested maybe a dash or 99, you know, what should I code? So in this case, with the LTAC care data set, the self-care and mobility items do not need to be completed at discharge if the patient has an incomplete LTAC stay due to an unexpected discharge. And what you'll notice is that when I was going over the self-care items, I mentioned that the planned discharge form is completed. The unplanned discharge form and the expired forms do not have Section GG items, and that's because if somebody has an unexpected discharge, those items don't need to be completed, and so basically you'd be completing the unplanned discharge form and the expired form, so there's nothing for you to code on those items related to GG. I did want to note, too, that we do not have a 99 code. I did go over the coding, and we'll be going over that again shortly, but there is no 99 code, and as I mentioned before, dash use, there's more information about dash use in the LTAC care data set in section 3 on page 6. So I would refer you to that page. Okay, we also received quite a few great questions related to coding goals for both self-care and mobility. So I wanted to spend a bit of time going over some of the questions and give responses to some of the self-care goal questions. So the first question that we have here is for GGO 130 items, that is the self-care items. When must the goals be established and entered? And the response to this question is discharge goals can be established at the time of admission based on the admission assessment by the clinician, discussions with the patient and family, the clinician's professional judgment, and the clinician's professional standards of practice. This information would be completed during the 3-day assessment period. Another question that we had related to goals, specifically about self-care goals, was please provide some guidance regarding documentation needed to support the discharge goal. What if the goal will clearly not be attainable? Do we need to modify the form? So there's several questions there. So first of all, discharge goals can be established as the patient's plan of care is developed. At least one functional status goal for either self-care or mobility is reported on the admission LTAC care data set in order to meet the LTAC quality reporting requirements. So as probably you're aware, as part of the LTAC quality reporting program, CMS adopted a measure, quality measure, process measure focused on the collection of functional status data on admission and discharge and the documentation of at least one goal for self-care or mobility. So that is why there is that requirement as part of the LTAC quality reporting program. We recognize that goals may change during the course of the patient's stay. However, the goal coded on the admission form would not be modified after the admission assessment period. So certainly, as I just indicated, you may put a goal down that somebody, let's say, on admission, perhaps they were not able to do oral hygiene, they were dependent, and the goal is for the person to get to, let's say, supervision level 4, but maybe the patient, for whatever reason, wasn't able to attain that goal, and so their discharge score ends up being perhaps a 2 or a 3. That's okay. You would not go back and change the goal in this instance. Okay, the next question also related to goals. So the question submitted was, are we required to create a care plan for section GG? If we establish a discharge goal, do we need to list the interventions we plan to reach the discharge goal? And the response to that is that goals should be established as part of the patient's care plan, and the clinician reports at least one goal for one of the items in section GG 0130, that is self-care, or GG 170, mobility. The goals provides documentation that a care plan was established. The list of interventions is not reported on the LTAC care data set. So the quality measure name does reference a care plan, but as I just indicated, the goal is documentation that a care plan was established. So again, you're not reporting interventions on the LTAC care data set, you're just reporting one goal. And the next question also is related to goals. So we actually did get a lot of questions about this, so I did think it would be important to reinforce. So the question specifically was, should we code one goal for GG 130 self-care and one goal for GG 170 mobility sections, or at least one goal for these two groups of items? So the response to that question is that for the quality measure, you do have to report at least one goal for one of the mobility items in self-care or mobility, but certainly if the care plan addresses different activities, several different activities, we would certainly encourage you to document goals in order to track whether patients are reaching their goals in the area of function. Okay, next we'll move over to the mobility section. So again, the graphic on the slide shows you what the LTAC care data set looks like, and there are more mobility items on here because we have a range of activities going from bed mobility type activities all the way to ambulation, as well as use of a wheelchair. So on the left side of the page, you see the 6-level rating scale and the activity not attempted codes. The first column is, which is highlighted in the goals box, is where you put the admission performance scores. The second column would have the goal if you're reporting goals for any of those items. And the other gold boxes that are highlighted are indented because those are gateway questions, and so we'll cover those in just a few minutes. Going on to the next slide, you can see the goal column highlighted here in gold. And again, in terms of the rationale, as we have stated during the training as well as several times today, the LTAC patients are medically complex and many of them have mobility limitations on admission, so many of them are at risk for functional decline during their stay. The rating scale coding instructions are provided on the next slide, and just as with the self-care activities, these items are completed on admission and on the planned discharge form. We do not need to know functional status data if the person has an unplanned discharge and you're completing that form, or if the patient passes away. So again, if A0 to 50 is coded either 1 for admission or 10 planned discharge, you would be completing these items. The codes, again, the same level, same 6-level rating scale is used. And I did want to review in this part some of the steps for the assessment. So this is not on the slides, but it is in your LTAC care data set quality reporting program manual. Specifically, it is in section, chapter 3, section GG on page 3, GG3. And so just again, this is reinforcement from what we covered in November. In order to assess the patient, you are asked to observe directly the patient's status, or the therapist or nurse or whoever is collecting the information. But the information can also be obtained, or supplemental information can be obtained, including patient self-report, family report. Direct care staff can also provide. We had examples of certified nursing assistants, and in the training manual we also had several examples where we had a nurse interview a certified nursing assistant to gather the functional assessment data. The patient should be allowed to perform the activities as independently as possible as long as the patient is safe. If helper assistance is required because the patient's performance is unsafe or of poor quality, score according to the amount of assistance provided. Activities may be completed with or without devices. As you have, as we mentioned earlier, there is a part of the data set where you can document somebody is using a wheelchair. Use of devices to complete an activity would not affect coding of the activity. And also, I know we did get a question submitted about how to define usual status. So one of the steps in the assessment does address that. If the patient's self-care performance or their mobility performance varies during the assessment time frame, which is the 3-day assessment period, report the patient's usual status. And that would be not the patient's most independent performance and not the patient's most dependent performance, but what is typical and reflects their status at the time of admission. Okay, so getting back to the slides, in section GG, as I mentioned before, there are items that cover bed mobility. So the first few that you see listed on slide 57 is roll left to right, sit to lying, lying to sit beside a bed, sit to stand, chair to bed, chair transfer, and toilet transfer. And again, we went over the definitions during the training, and there are obviously a lot of details in the manual, so I won't read the definitions now. The next set of items are on the next slide, and that actually starts off with a gateway question asking, does the patient walk? And we did get several questions about this, so I just wanted to clarify that if the patient does not walk at the time of, let's say, admission, you would respond no, would be coded 0 if the person does not walk and there was not a walking goal anticipated for the person. It was not clinically indicated. No would also be coded 1 if the person was not walking, but a walking goal was clinically indicated. And so that allows a goal of walking to be reported on the admission assessment. And then if the person is walking, you would code 2, and that then opens up the opportunity to code the admission assessment for walking 10 feet, walk 50 feet with 2 turns, and walk 150 feet. Okay, so wanted to go over some questions next. So the first question relates to 2 or more helpers. And I know we did get through the chat several questions about this also. So if a patient requires 2 helpers and participates in an activity to some extent, should the code be 1, dependent, or 2, substantial maximal assistance? And the response to that is that the code would be 1, dependent, if the patient requires the assistance of 2 or more helpers to complete the activity, even if the patient participates in completing part of the activity. So basically what I'm saying here is that level 1 would always be coded if 2 or more helpers are needed, even if the patient does participate in the activity by performing some effort. Okay, the next question relates to patient refusal. So we had a question from the November training. If a patient refuses to attempt an activity because he would not feel safe completing the activity, would the correct code be 07, refused, or 88, not attempted due to medical condition or safety concerns? So the response to that question is the clinician would make a judgment about whether there is a safety concern or not. If the clinician agrees with the patient's concern that there is a medical or safety concern, code 88 not attempted due to medical condition or safety concern. So again, it would really be dependent on the circumstance for that answer. So the clinician would use their judgment. Okay, another question that we had was about use of a mechanical lift. So this was, I think several people submitted similar questions on this topic. How would you code transfers if 2 helpers are required for the use of a mechanical lift and the patient does some effort? So the correct response to that is that when 2 helpers are required for a patient to complete an activity, code 1, dependent regardless of whether the patient assists with any portion of the activity. If a mechanical lift is used and the assistance of 2 or more helpers is needed, code 1, dependent. Another question that we got, which was just a very broad question, was asking us to give some examples of setup or cleanup assistance. So on the next slide, we have several examples that I'll go through, and we focused on mobility examples because this is the mobility section. So the first example is for the item sit to lying. And in this example, the helper places the bed rail in the upright position, and the patient uses the bed rail to move from a sitting position to a lying position. So in that case, the helper put the bed rail up and the patient used that in order to perform the activity of sit to lying. Second example is bed to chair transfer. In this example, the helper places the patient's wheelchair next to the patient's bed and moves the wheelchair footrest out of the way so the patient can transfer into the wheelchair safely without supervision, cueing, or physical assistance. So once, just in this example, I thought it was important to add that piece about not needing supervision, cueing, or physical assistance, because as soon as cueing or supervision assistance is required, the patient's score would be a level 4. But in the example, the helper basically got the wheelchair ready and could leave the room so the patient can transfer safely. And it may be, in one circumstance, the patient might be able to move the armrest him or herself, but the patient helper moves just the footrest. It doesn't matter how much setup is done. Setup would be coded whether it was a couple of the wheelchair setup issues or just one of them. The last example that we have on this slide is another example of bed to chair transfer. So in this example, the helper provides a slide board to the patient, and the patient uses the slide board to transfer from his bed to the wheelchair. And again, I put that little note that the helper does not provide any supervision, cueing, or physical assistance. So as long as it was just the setup that was provided, that would be coded level 5. Once the patient requires any kind of cueing or supervision, the score would go down to level 4. Okay, we're going to now move to a few more examples and do some polling. So in this scenario, it is related to bed to chair transfer. And Mr. L has experienced a stroke, and he's not currently able to walk. He uses a wheelchair for mobility. When Mr. L gets out of bed, the certified nursing assistant moves the wheelchair into the correct position and locks the brakes so that Mr. L can transfer into the wheelchair safely. Mr. L has been observed several times to determine any safety concerns, and it was documented that he transfers safely without the need for supervision. Mr. L transfers into the wheelchair by himself, that is, without a helper, after the certified nursing assistant leaves the room. So the polling question up next is, how would you code GG 170E, which is bed to chair transfer for this gentleman? Possible responses that you will be able to choose from on the poll are 6, independent, 5, setup or cleanup assistance, 4, supervision or touching assistance, and 3, partial moderate assistance. So the polling question will be up momentarily. There it is. And the example is at the top of the polling. I see we've got answers for each of the options. Just give it a minute. Okay, looks like we've got a few people coding level 1. We've got quite a few people coding level 2, or option 2, I should say, sorry. Okay. Okay, so the correct response most people did get, that was code 5, which was the second option. So code 5, setup or cleanup assistance. And the rationale for that response is that Mr. L is not able to walk, so he transfers from his bed to a wheelchair when getting out of bed. The helper provides setup assistance only. Mr. L transfers safely and does not need supervision or physical assistance during the transfer. Okay, moving to the next example. So we have another polling example. So this particular one is about walking 10 feet. And here's the question, or the example is, Mrs. U has an above-the-knee amputation and severe rheumatoid arthritis. Once the nurse has donned her stump sock and prosthesis, Mrs. U is assisted to stand and uses a rolling walker with only touching assistance provided toward the last half of her 10-foot walk. How would you code GG0170I? So the polling options that you can choose from are 6, independent, 4, supervision or touching assistance, 3, partial moderate assistance, and 1, dependent. Okay, the polling question is now up. The example is in the screen. Okay, looks like we're getting responses mainly for 4 and 3 at this point. Okay. All right. Great. So the response with the answer that you gave with the most responses is indeed correct. That is 4, supervision touching assistance. And so the rationale for that is that the helper provided touching assistance for the patient to complete the activity of walking 10 feet. Assistance getting from a sitting to a standing position is not coded as part of this item. So I believe the way it's described in the manual is that it starts while the person is in the upright position. Okay, next I wanted to spend a bit of time talking about the wheelchair items, and these are the last set of items on the LTAC Care data set in the mobility section. So as I mentioned before, there are basically gateway questions, and in this case, some follow-up questions. So the first question for follow-up, or for the gateway question is, does the patient use a wheelchair or scooter? If the answer is no, you code 0 and go to the next section, which happens to be bladder continence. If the answer is yes, then you would continue to the next item, which is wheel 50 feet with 2 turns. So wheel 50 feet with 2 turns is coded using the 6-level rating scale. If the patient does wheel 50 feet with 2 turns, then you are asked to indicate the type of wheelchair or scooter used, and the responses, which is for RR1, item RR1, are 1 manual and 2 motorized. The other question about wheelchair mobility is a longer distance, so this one happens to be wheel 150 feet, and this starts once the person is in a seated position in the wheelchair or scooter, and the 6-level scale would be used to indicate how much assistance the patient needed to go 150 feet. The follow-up question here, SS1, asks, what type of wheelchair or scooter is used. And the options are the same, that it could be 1 manual or 2 motorized. We did feel it was important to have follow-up questions for both of those items because it's certainly possible that a patient may be using a manual wheelchair for shorter distances and perhaps a scooter or a motorized wheelchair for longer distances. So that's why we have follow-up questions for each of those items. And then wanted to wrap up with one last question that we got from the LTCH training that was done in November. So that question is, for GG0170Q1, if a patient is paraplegic and remains in bed during the 3-day assessment period, should the item be coded as 0, no, even though he will use a wheelchair by discharge? And the response to that question is, if the patient does not use a wheelchair during the admission assessment period, code 0, no, for the item GG0170Q1 at the time of admission. If the patient uses a wheelchair or scooter at the time of discharge, code 1, yes, for this item at the time of discharge. So the next slide just provides a summary. So as I started out, I mentioned that we were doing a brief review and providing responses to some of the questions that came up during the LTAC training in November. We also gave some additional scenarios for you to think about the coding. And so, again, we wanted to be sure that you felt comfortable with coding. There are additional examples in the training manual that we did not cover in November or during this webinar. And so at this point, I think I will wrap it up by saying knowledge about the person's functional status prior to the current event can inform treatment goals, and that's why the prior functioning are included, as well as the admission and the discharge functional status items. So at this point, I will turn it over to my colleague, Terry Eng, to pick up.
Thank you very much, Anne. If you have additional questions about Section GG, please be sure to enter your questions into the chat panel located on the lower left corner of your screen. And as we've mentioned, questions will be answered during the Q&A session after all of today's presentations. It is now my pleasure to turn the program over to our next speaker, Ms. Terry Mata, who will be presenting on Section M, Skin Conditions. Terry?
Hi, this is Terry Mata. Thank you, Terry. And as Terry just stated, I will be going over Section M, Skin Conditions. So first, we're going to go over the objectives of this session, which are to review the intent of Section M, explain and clarify different aspects of pressure ulcer coding based on questions we received during and after the November 2015 LTAC Quality Reporting Program provider training, and we're also going to go through some coding scenarios together. But first, the intent. The intent of Section M is to document the presence, appearance, and changes that may occur in pressure ulcer status. I thought it would be helpful to define pressure ulcers as it appears in the LTAC Care Quality Reporting Program Manual. So pressure ulcers are identified as localized injury to the skin and or underlying tissue, usually over a bony prominence, as a result of pressure, or pressure in combination with shear and or friction. So it's important to keep this definition in mind when coding pressure ulcers in Section M. It is also important to assess the etiology of any ulcer, as that will guide whether or not the ulcer conforms to the definition of a pressure ulcer. So let's move on now to clarify pressure ulcer coding based on some of the questions we received from November's training. One question we received was regarding reporting of other wounds. Well, there are no other wounds or other types of ulcers that are reported in Section M. Ulcers such as arterial, venous, diabetic, or those at the end of life are not reported on the LTAC Care data set. The only ulcers that get reported in Section M are pressure ulcers. This is because the etiology of these other ulcers is different from the etiology of a typical pressure ulcer. For example, ulcers that occur at the end of life, more commonly known as terminal or Kennedy ulcers, have an etiology that is due to multiple organ and skin failure as a part of the dying process, and therefore does not follow the typical pressure ulcer trajectory, going from possibly what might appear as a stage 2 pressure ulcer blister, but which rapidly evolves to stages 3 and 4 within about 8 to 24 hours of identification, and is therefore, when identified as such, not reported on the LTAC care data set. We were also asked to speak to the National Pressure Ulcer Advisory Panel, or NPUAP, staging definition. The pressure ulcer staging definitions on the LTAC care data set are adapted from the 2007 NPUAP pressure ulcer staging guidelines. For example, the NPUAP staging guideline definition for stage 2 does not include the information regarding the type of fluid within an intact blister that we include in the LTAC QRP manual. And this is primarily because CMS opted to discuss an holistic approach to pressure ulcer assessment that included the characteristics of surrounding skin instead of a pure focus on what type of fluid was visible inside of an intact blister. This approach was affirmed via discussion with pressure ulcer subject matter experts both within and outside of the NPUAP. So although there are some differences between the LTAC Care QRP manual and the NPUAP guidance, LTACs must use the guidance in the LTAC manual to complete Section M, but certainly can use NPUAP guidelines for their own clinical documentation. Another issue we were asked about was the time frame for present on admission. What present on admission is referring to is the status of the pressure ulcer as close to the actual time of admission as possible. This information would be obtained from a skin assessment that was completed and documented at that time. So for the admission assessment, any pressure ulcer that is identified on admission as defined would be captured in M0300 at the appropriate stage. If there are any discrepancies related to pressure ulcer coding between clinicians, that should be rectified prior to entering that information on the LTAC care data set. For the discharge assessment, the coding instructions for present on admission, which are items M0300 B2 through G2, guide you to code the current number of unhealed pressure ulcers present at the time of discharge that were also present on admission to the LTAC. This item is completed for both planned and unplanned discharges. So what this item is essentially looking at is what the status of the pressure ulcer was on admission and if that status is the same as on discharge from the LTAC. So let's take a moment to look at some scenarios to better understand how these items work together. After I read through the scenario, you will be provided with a polling question. So the scenario is a patient arrives at the LTAC on day 1. A clinical skin assessment is completed on admission with no pressure ulcers identified. On day 3, while bathing the patient, a stage 2 pressure ulcer was noted on the patient's sacrum and documented in the patient's medical record. The patient was discharged with a stage 2 pressure ulcer 8 days later. And the question is, how would you code M0300 on the admission and discharge assessments? So the polling question provides you with 4 possible responses. 1 is code as 1, the second is code as 2, third is code as 0, and the fourth is skip. So I'm noticing quite a few responses here from 1, 2, and 3 as responses to the scenario. I'll give folks a little more time, but it looks like the third response is getting the most here right now. Okay, So the answer to this question of how to code M0300B1 is number 3, code as 0. Now let's look at the coding for the discharge assessment. How would you code M0300B1, number of stage 2 pressure ulcers, on the discharge assessment? Again, you have a polling question there with responses. Okay, quite a few people looking at code 1, some on code 2. Okay, and a small percentage on code 3. All right, so the answer to this is number 1, which is what the majority of folks chose. And finally, we're going to look at how to code M0300B2, number of stage 2 pressure ulcers present on the discharge assessment. And your responses should be there for code 1, 2, 3, and 0. We have quite a bit of activity amongst all of the codes here. Okay, looks like a lot of people are landing on coding it as 1. The next popular answer is 0. Okay, so the result of that is that the answer is number 4, code as 0. And these are the answers as they would appear on the item set, if you were coding them on the item set. And now let's look at the rationale for the coding of these items. Even though the patient had a pressure ulcer identified on day 3 of the LTCH stay, remember that it is only those pressure ulcers that were present as close to the time of admission as possible that are coded on the admission assessment. Therefore, no pressure ulcers were coded in M0300B1 on the admission assessment, and M0300B1 is coded as 1 on the discharge assessment because the patient was discharged with a stage 2 pressure ulcer, and M0300B2 is coded as 0 on the discharge assessment because the stage 2 pressure ulcer was not present on admission to the LTAC but developed during the stay. So let's try another example. A patient enters the LTAC with a stage 2 pressure ulcer. On day 2 of the patient's stay, the wound is reassessed as a stage 3 pressure ulcer. The wound does not heal by the time of discharge 2 weeks later. How would you code M0300 on the admission and discharge assessments? And we have another polling question coming up with responses as code 1 and code as 2, code as 3, or code as 0. Looks like we have a majority of the people looking at coding it as 1. And a few distributed between the other 3 codes. Okay, so the answer to this, yes, was code 1. That's how you would code M0300B1. Now let's look at how to code M0300B1 on the discharge assessment. Again, you have the polling responses available to you as code as 1, code as 2, code as 0, or the 4th is to skip. And again, it looks like we have some distribution between a few of the codes, but mostly people are looking at code as 0. Okay, and that is the correct answer. It was code as 0, which was number 3. And now let's look at how to code M0300B2 on the discharge assessment, and that is the present on admission item. Okay, if folks need to refer to the scenario, it's available at the top of the polling question like it has been. Looks like we're almost neck and neck with coding as 1 or coding as 0. And smaller percentages on the other two options. Okay, great. So the answer is number 3, coded 0. Now let's look at the coding for stage 3 pressure ulcer that was present on discharge. How would you code the number of stage 3 pressure ulcers present on the discharge assessment? Okay, wow, we have a lot of people saying to code as 1. Okay. So that is correct. The answer is number 1. You would code 1 stage 3 pressure ulcer on discharge. And finally, how would you code M0300C2, number of stage 3 pressure ulcers present on the discharge assessment? I have a lot of activity here for code 1, some for code 0. Okay. And the polling is closed. And the response to this is number 4, which was coding it as 0. And again, this next slide shows what the answers would look like on the LTAC care data set that's entered. And now let's look at the rationale for this example. So M0300B1 is coded on the admission assessment because the initial stage of the pressure ulcer was a stage 2 on admission, even though it subsequently worsened during the 3-day assessment period. And this is because the initial stage of the pressure ulcer, as close to the time of admission as what's reported on the LTAC care data set. M0300B1 and B2 are coded as 0 on the discharge assessment because the stage 2 that was present on admission is no longer present on discharge. M0300C1 is coded as 1 on the discharge assessment because the stage 2 pressure ulcer developed a deeper level of tissue damage during the LTAC stay and is now a stage 3 pressure ulcer on discharge. And M0300C2 is coded as 0 because the stage 3 pressure ulcer that is now present on discharge was not present on admission. Moving on to switch gears to section M0800 item, and this is the new and worsened pressure ulcer item. So the item rationale for M0800 is essentially a review of the patient's skin status since the admission assessment. In order to track changing skin status, this item documents the skin status on discharge. This entails a review of the assessor looking at the history of each pressure ulcer that's present on discharge. Specifically, you're looking to determine if the current pressure ulcer was not present at admission, or whether the current pressure ulcer has increased in numerical stage since admission. Tracking of pressure ulcers over the LTAC stay is consistent with good clinical practice. So let's look at the coding example and see how it applies to item M0800. A patient is admitted to the LTAC with a stage 2 pressure ulcer. The ulcer develops a deeper level of tissue damage, exposing muscle, and is staged as a stage 3 pressure ulcer during the stay. The wound bed subsequently covers with slough and is identified as an unstageable pressure ulcer. The patient discussed his discharge plan with the LTAC and decided to go home with home health services and receive wound treatment at a local wound care clinic. On discharge, the patient record notes that wound debridement was not performed on the stage 3 pressure ulcer at the LTAC and would be performed at the wound clinic. So let's look at a polling question for how you would code M0800 on the admission and discharge assessment. Before we do that, we're actually going to run through the coding for section M0300 for both the admission and discharge assessment. So according to our example, there was pressure ulcer on admission. Therefore, on the admission assessment M0300B1, the number of stage 2 pressure ulcers would be coded as 1. On the discharge assessment, stage 2 pressure ulcer that was present on admission is no longer present on discharge. So M0300B1 and M0300B2 on the discharge assessment are both coded as 0. Now in the scenario, it notes that the stage 2 that evolved to a stage 3 subsequently covered with fluff. So how would the assessor code this on discharge? Well, on the discharge assessment, M0300F1 would be coded as 1 because there is one unstageable pressure ulcer due to slough and or FCAR on discharge. And for M0300F2, it would be coded as 0 because this unstageable ulcer was not present at this stage on the admission assessment. So now that we have this information, let's look at M0800 and how we would code based on the scenario. So here comes your polling question. How would you code M0800A, stage 2, worsening in pressure ulcer status since admission? And your responses are code as 1, code as 2, code as 3, or code as 0. It looks like we have a lot of people coding as 1, some as 0. Okay, it looks like more of the majority is falling into coding it as 1. Okay, so the answer is actually 0 for M0800A because there are no new or worsening pressure ulcers identified at stage 2 on discharge. Let's move on to M0800B, which is worsening in pressure ulcer status since admission for stage 3. And again, you have your polling question responses for coding as 1, as 2, as 3, or as 0. And remember, these are the number of pressure ulcers, not the stage at this. We're coding for stage 3, but we're coding for the number of pressure ulcers at that stage. So we're looking at coding as 1, coding as 0, a couple in the middle for 2 and 3. It looks like we're almost half and half on coding as 1 or coding as 0. Okay, so we are split between coding in 1 and coding as 0. The answer here again is actually 0 because there are no new or worsened stage 3 pressure ulcers on discharge. So moving on to M0800C. And this is stage 4, worsening in pressure ulcer status since admission. So this is asking how many stage 4 pressure ulcers were either new or worsened since admission. And you have your coding responses as code as 1, code as 2, code as 0, or skip. Okay, we have a lot of zeros. Great. Some code as 1, a couple skipping. Okay, that's great. The answer here, again, is 0. And this is because there are no new or worsened stage 4 pressure ulcers. Let's continue on to M0800D. And this is coding for unstageable due to non-removable dressing or device. You have your polling question responses there, similar to the last one. Okay. We're getting a good majority coding at 0, some as 1, and some skipping. Okay. And the answer to the previous one was 0. There were no pressure ulcers due to dressing a device. And then let's look at M0800E, which is the worsening of pressure ulcer status since admission for unstageable slough and or ASCAR. And your polling questions are coming up. And if you need to look at the original scenario, it's up at the top. And now we have a lot of people coming in at code 1. I'm at code 0. Okay, looks like it's code 0. Okay, looks like it's mostly between those two codes. Okay, great. So the answer here is number 1, code is 1, and that's because the original stage 2 pressure ulcer that was identified on admission was now covered with slough. And let's look finally at M0800F, which is the unstageable due to deep tissue injury. And there's your polling question, the same responses as before. And it looks like we have a good majority coding 0. Very few coding as 1. Okay. That's great. And this was actually coded as 0 because there are no unstageable pressure ulcers due to deep tissue injury. So now that we've looked at how to code these items, let's take a look at the rationale. According to the scenario, we identified that the stage 2 pressure ulcer that was present on admission further evolved to a stage 3 pressure ulcer during the LTAC stay, moving from a partial thickness wound to a full thickness wound. This wound then covered over with slough prior to discharge. The ulcer was not debrided prior to the patient's discharge. So in order to complete the M0800 items, as the assessor, you would be looking back through your clinical documentation to determine if the ulcer that is present on discharge was either not present at that stage or had worsened to a deeper level of tissue damage since the patient's admission. In summary, Section M documents the presence, appearance, and change of pressure ulcers. There are no other types of ulcers or wounds captured in Section M. The LTAC Care data set uses pressure ulcer staging definitions adapted from the 2007 NPUAP pressure ulcer staging guidelines. The phrase present on admission refers to the status of the ulcer as documented on the skin assessment closest to the time of admission and is collected both at admission and discharge. And worsening in pressure ulcer status refers to a change in overall skin status since admission to the LTAC, where either a new pressure ulcer is identified since admission or the status of a pressure ulcer as changed, that is worsened, since admission. In reading the LTAC Quality Reporting Program Manual, including the intent, rationale, coding instructions, and working through scenarios provided in the manual, is the best way to fully understand coding in this or any section. And that's because the actual item sets don't contain all the information you might need to respond to the question, so it's really, really important to pay attention to the instructions in the manual. So that ends my Section M presentation.
Thank you very much, Terry. And again, please remember to enter any questions on Section M into the chat panel located on the lower left corner of your screen. As I've indicated, questions will be answered during the Q&A session after all of today's presentations. I will now continue on as your speaker to cover content pertaining to coding the influenza vaccine and Section O, as well as a review of available resources on the LTCH QRP program. In this session, I am going to do a focused review of Section O, specifically O0250, the influenza vaccine items, as the LTCH QRP team received questions from the November training program. We also received questions about the influenza items through the LTCH QRP Help Desk. During this session, I will also review definitions of the influenza season and the influenza vaccination season. I will discuss coding instructions for completing these items in or during the influenza vaccine season and outside of the influenza vaccine season. I will also present a few scenarios that we can practice coding to correctly and accurately code these items in Section O. The LTCH Care Dataset version 2.01 includes the O0250 influenza vaccine items on the admission, planned discharge, and unplanned discharge assessments. The influenza items pictured here were added to the expired assessment in the LTCH Care Dataset version 3.00. This is a new addition to the expired assessment and includes all of the same data items as the other assessments. As of 2014, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's Advisory Committee of Immunization Practices continues to recommend annual influenza vaccinations for all persons aged 6 months and older in the United States. People should begin getting vaccinated soon after the flu vaccine becomes available, if possible by October, to ensure that as many people as possible are protected before the flu season begins. However, as long as flu viruses are circulating in the community, it's not too late to get vaccinated. I would like to reinforce that the influenza season is July 1st through June 30th, and that the influenza vaccination season is October 1st through March 31st. The current influenza vaccination season is October 1st, 2015 through March 31st, 2016. I would like to encourage LTCHs to vaccinate patients outside of the influenza vaccination season if the patient has not been vaccinated. While administering the vaccination outside of the influenza vaccination season does not count towards the quality measure, it does benefit the patient. Please refer to the LTCH QRP manual for background information regarding why vaccinating patients is so important. This slide shows the quality measure. Percent of residents or patients who were assessed and appropriately given the seasonal influenza vaccine for short-stay patients, NQF 0680. The measure includes all patients in the LTCH 1 or more days during the influenza vaccination season who are admitted and or discharged during the current influenza vaccination season or are admitted before and discharged after the current influenza vaccination season. The measure is based on an LTCH stay defined as the day of admission to the day of discharge or if the patient expires. To be included in the quality measure, patients must have a discharge expired assessment. The influenza vaccine status is based on the admission and or discharge expired assessments. An example of a patient admitted or discharged during the current influenza vaccination season who would be included in the measure would be a patient admitted to the LTCH November 11th and is discharged December 23rd, or a patient is admitted January 2nd and is discharged February 29th. These patients would be included in the calculation of the quality measure. An example of a patient admitted before and discharged after the current influenza vaccination season who would be included in the measure would be a patient admitted to the LTCH July 28th and discharged October 2nd. Another example would be a patient admitted March 15th and discharged May 4th. The patient is admitted during the current influenza vaccination season and is discharged after the influenza vaccination season ends. Section O0250A is for patients with assessment dates within the influenza vaccination season, which, as previously mentioned, is October 1st to March 31st. This item asks if the patient received the influenza vaccine in this facility for this year's influenza vaccination season. If the patient did not receive the influenza vaccine in your facility during this year's influenza vaccination season, then you would indicate 0, no for O0250A. You would then continue to O0250C and indicate the reason the patient did not receive the vaccination. If the patient received the influenza vaccine in this facility during this year's influenza vaccination season, then you would code O0250A as 1 yes, and you would then enter the date the vaccination was received in O0250B. As previously stated, if the patient did not receive the influenza vaccine in this facility, you need to indicate the reason the patient did not receive it in 00250C. You would code the reason as 1 if the patient was not in the facility during this year's influenza season. You would code the reason as 2 if the patient received an influenza vaccination in another setting during this year's influenza vaccination season. Examples of other settings may include a physician's office, a health fair, a grocery store, a hospital, and other venues. You would code the reason as 3, not eligible, if the influenza vaccination was not received because of medical contraindications. Medical contraindications include but are not limited to allergic reaction to eggs or other vaccine components, previous adverse reactions to the influenza vaccine, a physician order not to immunize the patient, moderate to severe illness with or without a fever, and or a history of Guillain-Barré syndrome within 6 weeks of a previous influenza vaccination. The patient should be vaccinated if the contraindications end. Continuing through the coding instructions, if the patient was offered the influenza vaccine and the patient or responsible party or legal guardian has been informed of what is being offered and chooses not to accept the influenza vaccine, you would enter the code 4 for offered and declined. If the patient or responsible party or legal guardian was not offered the influenza vaccine, then you would enter code 5 for not offered. If the facility is not able to obtain the influenza vaccine due to a declared shortage, then code 6 would be entered into O0250C, inability to obtain vaccine due to a declared shortage. The patient should be vaccinated once the facility receives the vaccine. The annual supply of inactivated influenza vaccine and the timing of its distribution cannot be guaranteed in any year. The list of available influenza vaccines for the United States for the 2015 to 2016 influenza season is included on a table on the Centers for Disease Control website. You would enter the code 9 in O0250C if none of the listed reasons describe why the influenza vaccine was not administered. This code is also used if the answer is unknown. Now we'll walk through a couple of scenarios. Mrs. B received the influenza vaccine at an LTCH on January 15. She was discharged to a hospital and returned a week later to the same LTCH. How would you code O0250 for the first and second stay? So the options that you have here are code as 1, yes, code as 2, no. So most people have responded. Coding this item as 1 is correct. You would code O0250A as 1, yes, because the patient received the influenza vaccine while they were in the facility during this year's influenza vaccination season. You would code O0250A as 1, yes, for the first admission to the LTCH on the discharge assessment, and 1, yes, on the admission assessment when the patient was readmitted to the same LTCH a week later. You would also code O0250A as 1, yes, on the discharge assessment as well, whether the discharge was planned or unplanned as the patient was discharged to a hospital. In the next polling question, we ask, or I ask, how would you code O0250B? And as you can see, the options, we have 4 options, 3 dates, and skip. And that was a really quick response. So almost everyone has responded. And you are correct. The correct date is January 15, 2016. So you would enter the date as if this is the date the patient received the vaccine in this facility. A full 8-character date is required. If the date is unknown or the information is not available, a single dash needs to be entered into the first box. Moving on to the next polling question, how would you code O0250C? And your options are received outside the facility, not eligible, none of the above, or skip. Variety of answers here. Very interesting that people are responding to each of the options. Okay, the correct answer here is skip. Moving on to the next slide. To summarize the coding scenario, this slide summarizes the first scenario. So O0250A would be coded 1, yes. O0250B would be coded 1/15/2016, and O0250C would be skipped. And the rationale for this is that on Mrs. B's discharge assessment for the first stay, O0250A should be coded 1, yes, because she did receive the influenza vaccine in the LTCH during the influenza vaccination season. You were to enter the date, as we've already discussed, in O0250B. The same answer should be provided for O0250A and O0250B for the admission assessment and discharge assessment associated with Mrs. B's second stay at the LTCH. The next scenario, we have Mr. D, who was admitted to an LTCH on October 5th. The shipment of the influenza vaccine to the LTCH was delayed and not available before Mr. D was discharged on October 11th. How would you code O0250? You have the options of code 1, yes, code 0, no. So we have a very rapid response here. And you are correct. The correct answer is to code 0, no. And this is because Mr. D did not receive the influenza vaccine during his stay. The next polling question, how would you code O0250B? And you have 3 date options, and you have the option of skip. Again, we seem to be responding using the skip. And skip is correct, as Mr. D did not receive the vaccine during his stay. The next polling question is, how would you code O0250C? The options here are patient not in the facility during this year's influenza vaccination season, a 6, inability to obtain the influenza vaccine due to declared shortage, 9, none of the above, or skip. Seem to be hovering between coding it as a 6 or coding it as a 9. And the correct answer is none of the above. The reason that this is none of the above is that the delay was not due to a declared influenza vaccine shortage. It was just that the vaccine had not arrived at the facility during Mr. D's stay. So to summarize this scenario, you would code O0250A as 0, no. O0250B would be skipped. O0250C, if the influenza vaccine was not received, you would state the reason, code 9, none of the above. You would code the items in this way, as during Mr. D's stay, the vaccine was not available. We would only use the above coding sequence due to a delay in the shipment of the vaccination, not in the case of a declared shortage of the influenza vaccine. In the case of a declared shortage, code 6, inability to obtain influenza vaccine due to declared shortage, should be used. In summary, the influenza season is July 1st through June 30th. The influenza vaccination season is October 1st through March 31st. And as previously stated, the current influenza vaccination season is October 1, 2015, or when the influenza vaccine became available, through March 31st, 2016. You should code O0250A as follows if the patient received the influenza vaccine in this facility for this year's influenza vaccination season. Code 0 no if the patient did not receive the influenza vaccine in this facility during this year's influenza vaccination season. Then continue to O0250C if the influenza vaccine was not received and state the reason. You would code 1 yes if the patient received the influenza vaccine in this facility during this year's influenza vaccination season. The Q&A question is coming up shortly, so please be sure to enter your questions into the chat panel located on the lower left corner of your screen. Now I will move into reviewing resources that are available for your reference for the LTCH QRP program. In this brief session, I will highlight the LTCH QRP resources that are available to providers with their accompanying website or email addresses. The LTCH QRP website contains a comprehensive list of links that provide important information about the program. Included in this site are spotlight announcements that provide up-to-date information on what's new with long-term care hospitals. For example, the November 19th through 20th, 2015 LTCH QRP provider training question and answers are now available. A link is provided to access these questions and answers. The LTCH Quality Report, there are a number of other links in this particular website. The LTCH Quality Reporting Measures information includes a list of what measures are used in the LTCH Quality Reporting Program by payment determination year. Other items included are quality reporting technical information, quality reporting training. A revised Appendix D for the LTCH QRP manual was posted December 30th, 2015, and is also included in this link, or there is a link there. The quality reporting data submission deadlines, reporting reconsideration and exception and extension, the quality reporting help, and quality reporting archives are also located here. The archives contains information on previous LTCH QRP manuals, measures, etc. The next two resources are email addresses that you can use to ask questions about the quality measures or technical issues regarding the LTCH Care Dataset version 3.0. The next slide shows there are two resources, are email addresses for inquiries about access to the KEYS ASAP system and also inquiries regarding the CDC's National Healthcare Safety Network. Please be sure to enter your questions into the chat panel. Questions will be answered right after the break.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kaler-Ng. Everyone, we will now take another short break. Please refer to the timer on your screen for when we will promptly reconvene. I'm going to set the timer for 15 minutes. After the break, today's speakers will be addressing the questions entered into the chat panel. If you have any remaining questions, please be sure to enter them now. Thank you, everyone. We will return in 15 minutes.
Thank you for submitting so many thought-provoking questions. We will spend the next 15 minutes answering a pre-selected group of questions from those submitted today that can be addressed now. The others may require some additional team discussion before we can respond. However, we want to address all of your questions. So in the event that we need to meet as a team, our time doesn't permit us to answer questions today, we will be posting questions and answers on the LTCH QRP webpage. You will be emailed when the FAQ document is posted. Anne, would you like to be able to answer questions about Section GG that were submitted by today's audience?
Okay, great. Thanks, Terry. So I'm going to go through some of the questions. As Terry indicated, I do need to check with some of my colleagues on some responses, and I'm trying my best to get through all of them, so I appreciate all the questions that came in, and I will get to the ones that I've been able to write up responses to. So one of the questions that came in early was related to, on admission, my patient is totally ambulatory. Do I need to have a discharge goal for this patient? And the response is yes. You need to report at least one goal. And in this case, it may be that the goal is maintenance because, as you said, the person was independent, maybe for all mobility items. And so the goal may be a 6 for, let's say, walking 150 feet or walking 50 feet with 2 turns in order to maintain the person's function. I did want to reference that there are more details about coding goals in the training manual, specifically Chapter 3, page GG13 and GG14, and we give different examples of situations where the goal may be to improve function for some items. It may be that the goal is maintenance, or in some cases it may be that some patients are expected to decline. Another question was, my patient at discharge is only capable of walking 50 feet with assistance. What do I code for the 150 feet questions? So in the event that the patient can walk the 50 feet, you would code that item. But if they could not code 150 feet, perhaps it was maybe due to poor endurance, you would code 88 due to medical safety concerns. They were not able to complete that activity. Another question, at other facilities, who will be responsible for completing the Section GG items? So CMS does not provide guidance on who can or cannot assess particular items, but these are assessment items, so you would need to follow your facility, state, and national policies with regard to who can actually do an assessment. From the post-acute care payment reform demonstration, when we did testing of these items, we certainly found that many people from different disciplines were involved in assessment. Occupational therapists very involved in self-care activities, as well as nurses. In the area of bed mobility, that was also occupational therapists, physical therapists, nurses, and so, many clinicians were involved in the assessments during the testing. Another question that came in, if there were multiple hospital SNF LTAC admissions for the same illness spanning 8 months, for example, do we still go by prior functioning for the first admission? So if the clinician determines that this is basically one episode, then it would be acceptable to go back 8 months to the initial hospitalization. I'm hoping that I answered that question well enough. If there's a follow-up question, feel free to submit it. I'm doing my best with what was submitted, but sometimes they're partial questions, it seems, or they got split up a bit. Okay, the next question is in regard to GG0100B. So this is prior functioning related to indoor ambulation. So in this question, if a patient is unable to perform an activity prior to admission, as in they are quadriplegic or paraplegic, is the activity considered 1, dependent, or 9, not applicable? So in this case, you would code 9 because the person was in a wheelchair and did not walk prior to the current admission. And I just wanted to be sure that you also coded the wheelchair as a device in GGO 110, prior device use. And the reason that's important is that use of a wheelchair prior to the current event, illness, is a risk adjuster for the functional outcome measure, and we wouldn't necessarily know for sure why you coded not applicable in the ambulation prior functioning item, and so I would want to be sure that we captured that the person was in a wheelchair under the devices. Let's see, I got several questions to clarify if assistance of 2 is required. Is the patient coded 1? And the answer is yes. I'm not sure if that was submitted early on, but 2 people would be level 1. So that addresses several of the questions. Okay, I'm just moving to another document now. Okay, so somebody writes about goals. What is the best way to select the goals to report? For example, the goals where you expect the most progress. So it's up to the clinician to determine which particular items they'd like to report goals on, but certainly reporting items where functional improvement is expected would be really helpful because you could, for internal quality improvement, look to what extent patients met goals that were established at the time of admission when the person is discharged and you have the person's discharge function. Okay, another question. I got several questions about usual performance and variation in performance. And I did cover that a little bit after the break. So one person submitted a question. So the patient has a data array on eating such as 2, 3, 3, 3, 4, 4, 4, 5, 5. What score would you report? So I think I'll answer that on this webinar. I can certainly give more fully a full response later, but the intent of the function items at the time of admission as well as discharge, but on admission it's to capture the person's status at the time of admission when they enter the facility. So ideally you would not have scores that reflect improvement that the person's made while they're in the facility. But at the same time, certainly we recognize that when patients are admitted and perhaps somebody has some balance issues, the clinician is going to be very careful the first time they get them out of bed or help them, off the toilet. And so perhaps, figuring out what the person's ability is might not happen on day one. And again, we don't want to capture improvement that's a result of therapy that's been provided. So we're trying to get the person's status, but not some situations that reflect just the clinician and patient kind of learning to trust each other. Another question that came in was, does GG apply to pediatric patients? And the answer is no, there's no age restrictions. I will say, though, that for the quality measure, the functional outcome measure that is part of the quality reporting program, there are age exclusions for pediatric patients. And then I think I'll do one last one. Activities may be completed with or without devices. Use of assistive devices to complete an activity should not affect coding of the activity. With that understanding, why is set up on the slide board, slide 66, number 3, why would that be included in determining the code? So when I said that the codes were not affected by, there was not a code specifically for device use, I intended to say that there's no separate code, just that the person uses the device. So setup what does include providing devices to patients, and I gave examples of the slide board and then also the wheelchair, where somebody was setting up the wheelchair, getting the footrest, armrest out of the way. So if the person uses a device and assistance is given related to that device, you would code the person's ability with whatever devices they use. But again, there's not a separate code to indicate the person does or does not use a device. I think that's where I'll stop for now. So Terry, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Anne, very much. And we'll move on to Terry Mata.
Okay, thanks, Terry. So I received a few questions on Section M. One of the first questions I received was whether or not a wound is considered worsened only if it worsened numerically, so that if an unstageable wound, would be considered new. And an example was given that a stage 3 wound would become covered with slough, and that would be recorded as unstageable instead of being reported in the stage 3 item, which that's true. The definition of worsened is it also that's progressed to a deeper level of tissue damage, and therefore would be staged at a higher numerical number. So if a stage 3 pressure ulcer was reported in M0300C and it became covered with slough and or eschar, it would not be reported in M300C anymore on the discharge. It would be reported in M0300F. Another question I received was, our wound nurse does not see new admissions until day 2. Is that acceptable to use for staging admission pressure ulcers? So clinical assessments performed on patients in any setting should be completed according to accepted clinical practice, and it should comply with your facility policy and any state and federal regulations. So generally, the standard of practice for newly admitted patients is that patients' clinical assessments, are completed as close to the time of admission as possible, usually within 24 hours or so. So if your facility requires that the wound nurse completes that assessment within a time frame that coincides with accepted clinical standards and as enumerated in your facility policy, then it's acceptable that the LTCH care data set could be coded based on that assessment. And if you want more information, we have a couple of coding tips related to this question on page M5 of the LTAC manual. So the question was, can you clarify if device-related pressure ulcers are reported? It was said here that during the November meeting, the answer was no. However, they are referenced in unstageable pressure ulcers. And I'm assuming here that you mean the unstageable device dressing item, which is M0300E. So the definition for that item related to coding is on page M-17 of the LTAC manual, and it states that it includes a primary surgical dressing that can't be removed, an orthopedic device, or a cast. So it does not include things like endotracheal tubes, tracheostomy ties, elastic wraps, splints, oxygen tubing, and those types of things. Although we're not coding these items on the LTCH care data set at this point in time, I think it's really important to ensure that you're making sure that you have the right size medical device on a person, that their skin is protected in high-risk areas like over the bridge of the nose or over the ears, and to keep an eye on these areas as frequently as allowable while any of these other types of medical devices are in use. We also got a question about when is it appropriate to use a skip. Well, there are skip patterns that are actually built into the coding of some of the Section M items as they are for some other items on the LTAC care data set. So, for example, in M0300B, if you don't have any stage 2 pressure ulcers present, you would enter 0 and then skip on to the next available item. And those are the questions that I haven't to answer right now, so I'm going to switch back over to Terry.
Thank you, Terry. I will respond to a few questions from Section O. I also received one about the rationale for the skipped answer. I am going to make the assumption that the submitter was referring to one of my coding scenarios, And I'll just review that. The scenario was that Mr. D was admitted to an LTCH on October 5th, and the shipment of the influenza vaccine to the LTCH was delayed and not available before Mr. D was discharged on October 11th. And the question was, how would you code 00250B, which is the date the patient received the influenza vaccination? You would code this item as skipped because the patient did not receive the vaccination prior to his discharge because the shipment to the LTCH was delayed. If this submitter was not referring to this scenario, please feel free to send questions to the LTCH help desk, and we'll be happy to respond. Another question, the submitter was asking for more guidance on the influenza measure regarding patients that are admitted prior to the flu season. So any patient that is in your LTCH 1 or more days during the influenza vaccination season, which is October 1st through March 31st, you must have these items completed on their admission and discharge assessments. Another question was when Code 6, inability to obtain influenza vaccine due to a declared shortage, should be used, and who declares the shortage? And the response to that is that the CDC is the agency that declares there is an influenza vaccine shortage. And so what you could do is refer to or go onto the website to learn about the shortage. And the last question that I have is related to if the patient does not receive a vaccine in the facility and the item is coded either not offered, choice 5, or none of the above, choice 9, because the patient cannot cognitively respond appropriately to questions, or for a different reason, is that considered not assessed and counted against the facility's compliance? In this situation, you would code as follows. 00250A would be coded as 0. No, the patient did not receive the influenza vaccine in the facility. You would skip to 00250C if the influenza vaccine was not received and state the reason. 00250C would be coded none of the above because the patient could not cognitively respond to questions, and therefore the LTCH was not able to state the reason the patient didn't receive the flu vaccine. This ends the question and answer period. I want to thank our speakers, Ann Deutsch and Terry Mata, for sharing their time and expertise with us today. I also want to thank all of you who joined us today for the Long-Term Care Hospital Follow-Up Webinar for Providers. We hope today's presentations provided useful information and addressed those outstanding questions from the providers asked at the November training event. The post-acute care training team continues to plan more training events to be held later in 2016, so please be sure to check back regularly on the LTCH QRP webpage for updates. Thank you and have a great day.
And thank you, Dr. Ang. Thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us on today's webinar event. Everyone, we would love to hear from you. At the conclusion of today's event, you will receive a post-event evaluation for us to receive your feedback in order for us to make these training events and webinars most beneficial for you. I also wanted to let you know that if you want to download today's slides, you're able to do so if you click on the link that just populated in the chat box. It has a link to the PDF of today's slides for today's event. Alternatively, if you'd like to click on at the bottom right of your screen, there's a Documents button where you're able to click there and also download the PDF for your review. This concludes today's long-term care hospital quality reporting program follow-up webinar for providers. I'd like to thank you all for attending, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.